I'm with Ben Clasper, who's the Senior Vice President of Counterpoint Systems Limited, which is a rights management company. Ben, how have things changed over the years? For instance, like we just discussed right now, rights management for music or for television content. How has it changed from traditional broadcasting to now?
Well, I think the number one thing I think has moved is the fact that it's consumer-led, because when I go back when we started 25 years ago, even to when I started with this company 15 years ago, the only way anyone accessed content was because the content owner granted them the right to it, whether it was physical release of a CD to a shop, or put it on the radio, or sold it to BBC to put on the television. Unless they gave it to you, you couldn't access it. Now, the consumer can find content without the content owner being part of that process, legitimately, and in the eyes of the content owners, not legitimately.
Is that wrong? Or would you say that's just a different model of operating now?
I think it's a different model, and it's a different generation.
Yeah.
So people's expectations, we had a few subscription-based models in the old days, very few, video clubs maybe, things like that. But on the whole, you purchased the content that you wanted. I think subscription has changed that, and subscription in many consumers' eyes is almost the legitimization of what the content owners would have called the illegitimate model, i.e. I used to have a service online where I could stream and access all the content, and I didn't used to pay. Sometimes it was ad supported, so you're paying in another way, but now we're all happy to pay a subscription. And I think people have a tolerance for saying, I'll happily pay you $10 a month, but from the content side, I want to be unlimited. And occasionally, there might be a piece of premium content that I will happily pay you, and again, if the price point is correct. I think the issues the entertainment industry has faced has been primarily that their expectation of what that price point is now dramatically different from what the consumer's expectation is today. I think there's still some things out there that as a consumer, and I personally pay for everything that I consume. And I'm happy to pay. And sometimes I pay subscription, and sometimes I pay for that content, a single piece of content. The two things that make me very uncomfortable is one, a move towards my ability to share that content in a legitimate way. A legitimate way for me is for my kids, who maybe have a different account, to be able to watch that in the same way that if I'd bought a Blu-ray for $20 5 years ago, anyone in the house could have taken it off the shelf and watched it. And I don't think there's enough movement towards that. If you go and talk to any person in an iTunes store, they're going to tell you all have to have your individual accounts. And I say, I understand that. So how do my kids now watch the same piece of content? I say, well, they can't. I say, well, that's the bit I don't understand. And likewise, geography. I travel an awful lot. And if I pay for something, I don't expect to get off the plane, go to the same device that I looked at 4 hours earlier, only to be told that it's now blocked and I can't access it.
So you don't agree with the geographical...
It's not even geographical.
Footprint.
I'm logging on. They know exactly who I am.
Correct. And that doesn't make sense anymore in the current situation where the whole dynamics of broadcasting is changing.
No, absolutely. And I think there's migration. There's population migration. I look at my family, 2 generations ago, all lived within 5 miles of each other. Now I've got siblings, brothers, sisters in Australia and America, and lived in France. They were in Hong Kong 2 years ago. And we're still the same consumers. They pick up their music collections and they move it from geography to geography, and they'll come back. And on a subscription model, you can't do that. You can't pack your CDs in a box and move them.
So that's not fair on the consumer. So how can broadcasters change their own mindset? Because right now, there are a lot of anti-piracy movements in different regions.
I think if you don't make that content available in your region, then you're asking for trouble. Because all you've got is a consumer that wants access to your content. And that is universally a good thing. Because I think consumers are more positive about paying for content. Most consumers, in fact most people I know, only go illegitimate in the eyes of the owners when they don't have legitimate options. That's first. Okay, then you get to the next layer. What if the legitimate option is perceived as unfair? If I'm going to ask you to pay $2 a song next year instead of $1, what if to subscribe to your favourite sports network, I'm going to ask you for $40 a month, not $10 a month. There does become a point at which you are clearly being unreasonable. And I think that the most proactive companies out there are those that understand the difference now in how the consumer values the content and gets more of their content out there, and understands that you're not going to be able to demand the price that you could previously. So I don't like the word piracy because I think it lumps everything together, and I think it implies that the content owners have got all this great product out there, and the consumer has freedom of choice of all the different services, can pick and choose. And actually, that's not the situation. Everyone's limiting. I used to moan about back catalogs, music online. The best thing that happened for me for that was I used to like a lot of music back catalogue.
Yeah.
I couldn't buy in the shops. And back then, I had no legitimate way of getting that. In fact, I had no illegitimate way. When it suddenly becomes available, you've got to understand the consumer will go for that. And I think the more faith needs to be put in the consumer, the more content you get out there, the more means, the more freedom of choice of how to access and pay, the more likely you are to make more money than you were last year on your catalogue.
Okay. What's the compromise? I mean, as a rights management company, what kind of counsel do you offer to customers who would come to you and say, how can I make sure that all my content is copyrighted? Is that correct?
Yeah, it's covered. Well, the answer is you can't, not anymore. Google, YouTube put paid to that. I don't mean in a malicious way. It's just they make everything available, and also that sort of publish and be damned approach that was legitimised. I will take it down when you tell me that it's copyrighted.
Yeah.
I mean, no one else got away with that. I'll sell it. 20 years ago, you couldn't sell DVDs on the street off the back of a lorry and then say, "Oh, I'm really sorry," and I'll stop when you caught me. You got prosecuted for that. So that horse is bolted. So the content is now out there. How can you legitimise as much as possible? Well, I think for me, it's about availability of content. If I was running the company, I would be saying, I want to get my content licensed into as many territories as possible. Some territories they look at and say, well, the piracy is so high that there's no point giving my content to there, because all I'm doing is handing it a better copy of it to the pirates than they would have had access to yesterday, and maybe that will make things even worse. Well, rather than going, well, what if we actually do try and legitimise some of these territories, license into them? So what can they do? Well, the first thing they can do is they can go into business with local companies that can market and distribute and deliver content, understand the market. I think a lot of companies from 5,000 miles away look at a territory, don't understand it, will just say, right, it's just safer not to do business there.
Yeah.
Find someone local that does. Secondly, when you grant them the information or grant them the rights to that content, be clear about what they're going to use it for. What platforms, what windows. Is it television? Is it on demand only? Is it only available online? You're going to try and sell some physical product in that territory, and make sure that whoever your representative in there, can generate revenue from that market in the best way that they can, and as legitimately as they can with real product. I think after that point, I think it's out of your control.
Yeah.
I think that's probably the leap of faith that they're unwilling to take, because they're used to having that control in the markets where they know that they have maybe more controls in place, whether that's legally or with their own companies or subsidiaries in those territories. But I think unless you do start doing that, I don't think you've got much of a comeback when people in that territory that want your content and don't consider themselves criminals, or committing piracy, will find other ways. Whether that's subscribing to, getting it online, or subscribing to, foreign satellite feeds, which we have a big issue with in the UK at the moment, sports feeds in the EU. They will find another way to do it.
And are you trying to address that in the UK? How are you trying to address that in the UK? We have a similar situation in the Middle East where people are trying to get maybe a service that is not legitimate in the region, but they're trying to get it off a satellite. So how is that being addressed in the UK?
Oh, I'm intrigued on this at the moment, because there seems to be a sort of a bit of a standoff. So we've only had one test case. The big issue, where it's come to the fore in media in the UK, is sports feeds, pubs. It's the people that own bars and pubs that would have to go to the cable or the satellite provider and pay a very large subscription to feed into their bar, obviously based on occupancy or number of customers, and they have found cheaper options by going to subscribe to another EU-based satellite provider. Unfortunately, it's a very grey area in the EU because of the freedom of trade within the market. Actually, legally, there's nothing wrong with them doing that. Morally, maybe. because we still do carve rights up country by country in the EU, even though we're all supposed to be able to go cross-border, buy what we want, where we want, and bring it back. The only test case found in favour of the landlord of the bar, which is very interesting, is that, and I'm surprised there hasn't been more made of that. So it's almost as if that's happened, and now they're taking stock, and they're going to make a decision on what their next. The ruling was that she was not acting in an illegal fashion.
Yeah.
She was, I think it was a Greek channel. She was a satellite provider. She was subscribing to because she was getting it legitimately. She was paying for that service. She was being into another territory, and she was accessing. The customers were able to access that. But that's probably a lot of hassle for her. And I think that's the other thing people. It's not about condoning someone's behaviour.
Yeah.
Why did she do that? It's 10 times easier to phone up Sky, and have the guy down the road come and install it. To have a satellite put on your roof. I mean, I think people, that's what they're missing. How much effort it was to do that, and therefore the only reason she would have done that would have been because she felt there was something dramatically unfair about the supposed legal option on offer to her in her territory. And that goes, you can shrink that all the way down to one kid buying one song on iTunes. If they don't think it's fair, they won't pay it, and they will find a way that they think is a fair way of consuming it. And I've met people on vast ends of this spectrum, all the way up to, I go back to the music industry. When it first happened there, they managed to argue that it was copyright, it was theft, it was loss of income. They even got tax breaks, I think, on the income they supposedly lost because of people downloading for free. But the other side's true as well. How many of those downloads would have occurred as legitimate purchases if they'd had to pay for it?
Right.
And I can find you as many people that will say $10 million a year as will say zero. You lost nothing. Your content just isn't as good as it was, and your client base isn't going to pay what you want them to pay for it. And that's the problem. And because it's theoretical, no one can prove either. And I think what entertainment companies in particular need to stop doing is picking a position on that spectrum and validating every decision that they make as if that was true and gospel, because it isn't. They could just as easily be completely wrong as they are right. And I think we've all got to look at it a bit more pragmatically and say that is a consumer base out there, and a consumer base that will pay. Sometimes not directly for the content, they'll subscribe, they'll receive ads, but there will be money channeling back into you, and the consumer sees that as legitimate. So you need to stop treating them as if it isn't. They've just changed, and you need to change as well.